All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most important topics in modern Indian history, the Government of India Act of 1935. It's basically the absolute cornerstone, a massive, sweeping piece of legislation from the British Parliament. It literally laid the structural foundations for the modern Indian state, but at the exact same time, it tightened the leash on actual freedom. So let's unpack this fascinating paradox together.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the act unveiled, then look at the steps toward provincial autonomy and building modern institutions. After that, we'll hit the catch, British control, followed by the voting illusion, and finally, wrap up with the ultimate legacy of the act.
Okay, Section 1. The 1935 Act unveiled, a truly massive overhaul.
You know, the sheer ambition of this act was just staggering. It was enacted on August 2nd, 1935, and honestly, it was so huge it had to be rolled out in stages. The provincial provisions finally kicked in by 1937, but the boldest proposal of all, that was creating an all-India federation. The grand idea was to bring British Indian provinces and the semi-autonomous princely states under one unified central umbrella. But here's our first reality check. This grand all-India federation, it never actually launched. Why? Well, because the required number of princely states simply didn't agree to join. You got to remember, these princes weren't democratically elected representatives. They were rulers, and their participation depended entirely on them willingly handing over their own power. So when they flat out refused, the whole federal idea, which was a huge constitutional deal on paper, remained, well, purely theoretical.
Moving right along to Section 2, steps toward provincial autonomy. Let's look at how they empowered the provinces. To really grasp this, we need to quickly decode two terms. Previously, under the 1919 Act, provinces were stuck with diarchy, this kind of clumsy, divided system of government. Well, the 1935 Act famously scrapped that restrictive setup in the provinces. In its place, they brought in provincial autonomy. This was a total game changer because provincial governments got way more independence and control over provincial subjects was handed over to actual Indian ministers who answered to elected provincial legislatures. This paved the way for the 1937 elections, where Indian political parties successfully formed governments in several provinces. Pretty huge step, right?
But here's the kicker. They removed the roadblock at the local level, only to build a massive wall at the national level. While they abolished diarchy in the provinces to grant them autonomy, they turned around and proposed introducing diarchy at the center. Central subjects were split into reserved and transferred categories. And guess who kept absolute control over the reserved subjects? The British Governor-General. So they effectively blocked the development of a fully responsible central government.
All right, Section 3. Building modern institutions. Let's talk about the bedrock of the nation.
Despite those massive contradictions, the leaps forward in actual state building were monumental. I mean, this act birthed institutions that are literally still shaping India today. It provided for the Reserve Bank of India in 1935, creating a crucial central monetary authority. Then in 1937, it established a federal court to handle constitutional disputes, a massive step for India's judicial system. And it totally redrew the map. Sindh was separated from Bombay, Orissa became its very own province, and Burma was completely separated from India in 1937. The entire landscape was transformed forever. So with all these newly elected provincial ministries, redrawn borders, and shiny new institutions like the RBI and the federal court, we really have to ask ourselves this critical question. Was this genuine self-rule? Were the British actually handing over the keys to the country?
Well, that brings us to Section 4, the catch, British control. Let's read the fine print. The answer to that last question is a resounding no. The absolutely crucial point here is that the Governor-General retained enormous powers. So even with all these new representative institutions, the British executive held all the actual trump cards. The Governor-General could use discretionary powers, invoke special responsibilities, keep a tight grip on defense and external affairs, issue ordinances on a total whim, and just intervene in emergencies whenever they saw fit. At the end of the day, ultimate authority sat squarely with the British, not with elected Indian representatives.
And this heavy-handed control wasn't just at the top. Even down at the provincial level, where Indians supposedly had that shiny new autonomy, the provincial governors wielded a massive veto. They had the power to completely override elected ministers if they felt that peace and tranquility were threatened, minority interests needed protecting, or financial stability was somehow endangered. So sure, you might be an elected Indian minister, but the British governor could basically just override you whenever it really mattered. It completely undermined the whole idea of a responsible government.
Let's move to Section 5, the voting illusion. Just how democratic was this progress?
The act did expand legislative institutions, even bringing in bicameral or two-house legislatures in some provinces. But while they proudly boasted about extending the franchise, the reality was pretty brutal. Voting rights were strictly limited by hoops you had to jump through, like property ownership, taxation, and education levels. The result? As you can see, only a tiny minority, roughly 10% of the entire population, actually qualified to vote. 90% of the country was completely locked out of the democratic process.
And to make things significantly more complicated, the act continued and even extended the deeply controversial system of separate electorates. This meant specific communities only voted for their own specific representatives. Now, the British justified this by saying they were protecting minority rights, but as critics rightly pointed out, it actively fueled communal divisions. It was basically a structural enforcement of the infamous divide and rule policy, ensuring communities stayed politically separated.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, the ultimate legacy. Let's assess the real impact here. It's the classic 2 steps forward, 1 step back scenario. On one hand, we see undeniable structural progress, provincial autonomy, expanded legislatures, the birth of the RBI, and the federal court. But on the other side of the coin, we see the firm grip of the empire, those massive veto powers, a highly restricted voting pool, and the really toxic legacy of separate electorates. So yes, it was a major constitutional milestone, but it was absolutely not a modern democracy.
Still, despite not being an instrument of complete self-rule, we absolutely cannot ignore its greatest practical contribution. The 1937 elections finally allowed Indian political leaders to step into the actual halls of power. Running these provincial governments gave them vital, hands-on administrative and parliamentary experience. And you know what? That was exactly the experience they desperately needed for independence, which was just around the corner.
The British drafted this act to ration power and safeguard their imperial interests. Yet, ironically, the institutions it established ended up laying the very structural groundwork for independent India's constitution.
So it leaves us with this fascinating, provocative thought. How did a framework that was specifically designed to limit true independence inadvertently become the blueprint for the world's largest democracy? Thank you so much for exploring this incredibly important topic with me. This explainer was brought to you by Mega Education. Keep questioning the foundations of the past, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.